Want to invite the panel to join me on stage, and thanks y'all for sticking around on day 2 to have a conversation that I think is a nice capstone to a lot of the individual conversations we've all been having and the panel discussions that we've been hearing today. So for the past couple of days, we've heard from public sector leaders in Miami and South Florida and Los Angeles and around the world about how public sector officials are managing innovation on their streets and in their cities, and how the federal government is building new standards and new approaches for funding infrastructure investments to support new mobility options. I really loved the quote yesterday morning from the mayor of Miami-Dade County about the 4 E's of equity, the environment, sustainability, and I love the lovely 5th E of empathy. At the same time, we have a whole trade floor here with new technologies, new business models, new approaches to mobility and solving urban challenges. And so the panel today is really designed to have a sort of thoughtful conversation about how we can facilitate and manage that innovation, and really to talk in detail about how cities and companies are coming together to solve urban mobility challenges. My name is Lilly Shoup. As was mentioned, I'm a managing director of the Rebel Group. We are a consulting company that works with both public and private sectors to structure and govern public-private partnerships. I'm also on the board of Urban Movement Labs, which is a nonprofit in Los Angeles that structures innovation in the streets of Los Angeles. So excited to have this conversation today. We are joined from a rockstar group of panelists. At the far end, we have Ashwini Chhabra, who's Chief Public Policy Officer at Tier Mobility. Tier is the world's largest shared micromobility operator. They recently acquired Spin, and they manage everything from e-scooters to e-bikes and e-mopeds in markets around the world. Next, we have Ed Walker, Vice President of Shared Economy and Mobility at Hub International. Hub supports companies with risk management and insurance knowledge, especially in emerging markets like the gig economy. Next, we have Valerie Neilson, Interim Executive Director of Palm Beach Transportation Planning Agency. She leads a regional metropolitan planning organization at the forefront of thinking about how to move the market and invest wisely in infrastructure investments. And then finally, Carlos Cruz-Casas, Assistant Director of Miami-Dade County Department of Transportation and Public Works. And his primary focus there is to introduce mobility innovation and plan for a fully integrated transportation system in Miami, which many of us have had the pleasure of taking advantage of over the past few days. So wanted to start at the far end with Ashwini. Tier is providing mobility options in markets around the world, and especially in Europe, where the governance models are quite different than they are here in the US. So I was curious some of the trends that you see in structuring successful multimodal partnerships, and specifically what is needed from a private operator's perspective in what you're seeing around the world.
Thanks, Lily. Yeah, happy to talk about that. So, for me, when I started at Tier, it was a bit of an eye-opener to see how much more, how forward-leaning European transit agencies were on issues like mobility as a service and integrations with micromobility operators. So Tier currently has more than 40 integrations with MOS apps. 60% of those are public sector apps across 70 cities. I think just in last year alone, we facilitated something in the neighborhood of 800,000 trips through MOS integration. So the volume of these trips in European cities, where public transit really is the backbone of how you get around, is pretty impressive to me. And so coming into that context from the US context, it was really remarkable to me, and that it was something that I was very curious about, is why is this got so much traction here? And I think in a way the European markets are in some ways the ghost of Christmas yet to come for us. I think there's an understanding that to borrow the title of this panel, that these modes are complementary, not competing. And so we see more trips from customers. These are additive to what we otherwise would be getting to direct rides through these integrations. Likewise, the transit agencies are seeing more customers taking advantage of their service through our app. And so there is this realization at some point that you're actually growing the size of the pie by facilitating these introductions. I think the couple of things that seem to me bedrock in a successful integration like that are, one, getting the digital right? So so many of us turn to our screens for mobility. So you have to get that right. That unlocks payments, that unlocks loyalty programs, et cetera. But that's really just one element of it, and in many ways I think it's the least important element of it. The IRL element is so incredibly important, and that's something that I've seen across different markets. The way it's handled results in a very different outcome. And so where is the mobility hub in relation to a transit station? How robust is it? Where are the protected bike lanes that allow you to use micromobility to access those transit hubs? Have you built that out? Is that in your roadmap? And so the places where we've seen the most successful programs are ones where MOS and multimodality doesn't exist sort of independent, but it's part of a broader initiative to repurpose streets, repurpose parking away from car utilization alone to multimodality, to bike lanes, to micromobility lanes, and more walkable streets. And so that IRL element is incredibly important. And then, I think this crowd will appreciate the value of data and the sort of flow of data both ways, from the transit agency and from the public regulator to private operators, but then also back to the transit agency so that they can better understand where is their demand, where are there gaps in our system that micromobility or rideshare or car sharing are helping to plug, and where are there gaps in our infrastructure that we need to plug in order to unlock more of these trips and unlock the potential of these. So those are some initial thoughts, but those are, to me, I think we're in a place, and I don't mean to sort of say the Europeans have figured this out and it's our time to catch up, because there are actually some really interesting pilots that are happening in US cities as well, and would love to sort of dig into some of those over the course of our conversation.
Well, we can dig in right now because we have Carlos on the panel, and Miami-Dade has been just a tremendous leader in thinking, bringing pilots and working with partners to bring innovative business models and technologies to the South Florida region. And I'm curious your thoughts on the components of integration that were just mentioned. So making sure the business models are here on the streets, that you have the information out to customers to know what's available to them. And then you've done a ton on ensuring people can pay regardless of their banking status or without having to download another app. So curious how you're thinking about the next phase of pilots and scaling some of those innovations in the region.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So before I answer that, I want to talk to your point is if we leave alone our system, our mobility system, and we don't do anything, it will be competing with transit, right? So I think we need to take some actions. There is some policy we need to do, and some incentives we need to draw forward. And I think that's what we hear, and that's what I'm so thrilled to be, working with private sector in Miami-Dade County to identify that, where and when, a micro transit system works to feed the public transit system. The same with the scooters and the bikes, and let's not forget about taxis, limos, and Ubers and Lyft. They can all play a role in our system. So what we're starting to see is the next step. You're already seeing that we can provide micromobility solutions to provide access to transit, But if we're just saying, yes, Lilly, go in, use your app of choice, and take a micromobility solution to transit, and then pay full price for your bike share and pay full price for the transit, we're not necessarily helping you. So what we're trying to start looking into is how do we bring the value of that trip to align with the goals that we have as a community. If that micromobility trip is aligned with us, we as an agency should be thinking about providing the same extension of subsidies, of benefit incentives that we do for someone riding a train, someone riding a bus to that particular use. So that's one thing. And then I think we were talking earlier that there's a lot of competition and there's a lot of people that think that everything gets solved with one app, right? And I think, we are different. We have our likes and dislikes. I think, I don't care if we have one app, 17 applications out there, as long as all of them has the same information. In order to do that, we need to have a standard communication for transit. Transit's been doing great doing that. Micromobility's been doing great with GBFS, and now really kind of getting into the MDS component. So by doing that and standardizing the communication across all of them, we'll be able to make sure that you can use whatever application you want of choice. I'm proud that Miami-Dade Transit real-time information is not only in Apple Maps, Google Maps, Move It, Go Miami-Dade app, Lyft, Uber, all these applications have the same information and they provide you guidance towards using transit. That's one thing. And the other thing is payment integration is something that is a must. We need to start getting into standardizing the way we go across the board. And right now the technology is not quite there yet to get to all the different vehicles, but our next step will be bringing all that into one.
No, that's amazing. And I think that payment question is a really interesting one when we think about incentivizing sustainable travel options and the kinds of more equitable choices that people have now, while also pricing things in travel that we might want to see less of. And so that payment question becomes a really interesting policy lever we can pull. I'm curious from your work at the regional level at the MPO, how you're thinking about the ways that your organization is investing in the infrastructure to support new mobility options and to make sure that they are safe and reliable as we see more companies and more business models on the streets of the region.
Sure, thank you. And I'm so excited to be here on this panel, a mix of private and public partnerships. I'm with the Palm Beach Transportation Planning Agency, and we're the Metropolitan Planning Organization for Palm Beach County, but we work very closely in our region with Carlos as well, looking at how do we integrate, because a lot of this technology is moving much faster than what we can plan and prioritize our state and federal dollars, but we can prioritize this system of connected facilities, at least the infrastructure, to be safe and equitable and accessible to all users. So that's where we're looking at how can we connect at least the infrastructure, the bicycle facilities, the sidewalks, the roadways, the bus facilities, and make that all work together. But from our perspective, we also capture a lot of data in terms of where are these facilities, in terms of ridership, car vehicle capacity, and all of that, working with our partners. It's really important for our on the private sector and our transit agencies to make that data available and accessible so that everybody can leverage and share this data together to make it one cohesive system.
No, that's great. And I'd love to bring Ed into the conversation, especially as we're thinking about the new kinds of data and information and analytics that might inform both a public and a private sector decision-making and understanding around things like liability and insurance and all of the supportive infrastructure that these companies are using to make decisions about where to invest.
Yeah, absolutely, thanks. And I hope everyone can hear me okay. As we discussed earlier, there was a very, back in 2017 when scooters first launched on the market, ride-sharing really started to take off in different modalities. What first became a very antagonistic relationship on the insurance front. What is this premium bill? Why am I paying this? I'm just trying to put my operation on the road. What the heck is going on? I need some more answers behind this. Is now very quickly formed into a partnership model in which each and every one of these operators is really taking the bull by the horns, quite literally, into understanding their own company. What wheels are we putting on the ground? How are we impacting people's lives? How are we promoting a safe business year over year and improving that? And how can we codify that individually, both to ourselves as well to the insurance company alone? As we were talking about this before, one of the major components of this of any rideshare operation, micromobility across the board, is that most of the carriers who play in the space, a lot of them, even at this point with the data sets we have, a lot of them are still making educated guesses on who they're insuring and who we're speaking to. And this is actually very true across the board. And that data really, and the investment these companies have made into quantifying their exposures, they put countless dollars into to help promote safety, is a little bit of the part of the problem when we talk about public policy, because each and every one of these companies is very proud of the efforts they've put in and the safety they put forward. So asking for that data in an open portal to share it cannot always be an easy question, but I think a lot of the topics we've discussed today really promote the need for that across the board, and maybe a more generalization of the tiering of safety that these models bring to the table.
No, that's super interesting, and I think really speaks to the fact that we are sort of entering a second phase or a next generation of thinking about public-private partnerships and new mobility innovation. So phase one was really a learning period for everyone involved about what worked where and what management was needed in order to guide technology investments and ensure community outcomes. Now we have generated, almost 10 years of learnings across different kinds of suburban and urban forms. What is the next phase going to look like, and how can we be more nuanced in how we think about regulation and management and permitting to make sure that technology innovation is headed towards achieving community goals and outcomes? Carlos, I know this is something you've thought quite a bit about. I'd love to get your thoughts on sort of how Miami-Dade is thinking about that.
No, excellent. So I think, like you mentioned, we are now again realizing where each one of us fit, right? This is like that moment where we're trying to find our space in the mobility ecosystem. And I think it's been very clear that there's no substitute for a good and well-run transit. A bus, a rail, carrying a lot of people in the same direction at the same time, it is vital. And frequency is something that really people value. The one thing that we're seeing is that there's some other areas that we have new technologies, new solutions like microtransit that can come in and provide better accessibility to the riders. And we're starting seeing that we now to start changing the definition of public transit, and basically instead of thinking just bus and rail, think about bus and rail plus everything else can connect people to opportunities. So that's the first one that we start understanding is what is the travel demand, what is the mobility need that we need to start serving for. But then this idea that we don't have to provide all the services, but we can help incentivize the use of some of those, and we can perhaps cover some of the costs for a particular population that will use that. In particular, I'll mention scooters and bikes, right? We've seen that we love the scooters coming in. It's fun, yes, but it takes you places. It's an extension of your walkable network. But is that what we want for our community to be there? I would raise my hand and say, you know what? Other than being standing, a scooter is probably the smallest form factor for you in a tight urban area. However, it has other impacts to it. What about we start thinking about incentivizing bikes and e-bikes that can help people go further, that can continue to keep our residents active and increase our health outcomes, right? What type of things we can do? And that's where we come in terms of the incentives. We talk about money, that's one thing, cover some costs. We can probably incentivize the rider. We had a partnership with Velocia, a rewards program, where we're incentivizing riders to use micromobility services along heavy bus routes, so that way a person is willing and able to take a micromobility can free up a seat for someone that needs it. But at the same time, we can incentivize locations and devices out there. We have right now a pilot, I guess, a demonstration program in downtown Dateland. When we're allowing basically the micromobility devices to be out there, we enter into a memorandum of understanding where they abide by the rules that we bring in, and we deliver them through the MDS, which is a specification for providing digital policies. And I say that because now we have the opportunity to have vehicle caps. Right now, they can use 50 vehicles in the particular area if they're scooters. And I'm going to look at you. If you bring bicycles, I'm way more than willing to increase that cap to 75 or 100, right? So that's the type of things that we can do from the policies that we bring together.
Yeah, and I mean, from our side, we're coming to somewhat the same position, which is the more modes, the better. We see that there's actually very different customer base for scooter trips versus pedal bikes versus e-bikes versus whatever other modes. And so it is a question of there's a different vehicle for different mobility needs and different trip profiles. And so I think you're seeing increasingly a lot of operators who are offering multiple modes, whether it's rideshare companies going into micromobility, vice versa, or transit agencies sort of coming to the realization of actually the bus, which we think of as a public service, wasn't always a public service. These used to be private services. They've become public over time. We now think of that as the default of what is public transit, at least where I'm from. Similarly, I think you're going to see this evolution where bike share, you're already seeing it in many ways. Started out as a very private service. It's quasi-public in many places now, and I can see a day when it's much more akin to a bus service because cities realize this is actually a necessary service that people are looking to us to provide. We might do it with a private operator, we may do it directly, we may do some sort of hybrid service. So I think that breaking down of divisions between different mode types that's happening on the public sector side is also happening on the private sector side, and it's a beautiful thing when it's happening in the same places at the same time. You're sort of seeing this flourishing of new models. To your point though of like we're in this second phase, I think we very much are, and we were talking earlier about I think the first phase of multimodality of MOS experimentation was very much one of letting 1,000 flowers bloom, and we're at a stage where we do have a lot of data, we do have the experience of those pilot programs, and whatever we create now really needs to be done with deliberate design in mind. And so, what is it you're trying to solve for with a multimodality solution or with a MOS solution? Because doing it for doing multimodality for multimodality's sake is interesting, but it's very 2016. So like, what are we doing now? And I think of the SPIN program in Pittsburgh that involves a multimodal solution involving scooters, bikes, mopeds, carpooling, and car sharing is one of the first that I've seen at that scale, and that has that degree of deliberation and design that's gone into it. This was subject of an RFP. It's been more than a year in developing, and it launched just last year. And some of the results are really interesting because we talked about equity. A third of the spin trips in the program are people who have incomes of $35,000 or less. Yeah. The profile, the ethnic and racial profile of riders pretty much mirrors the broader ethnic profile of the population. So it isn't tech bros who are riding it. It is everyday Pittsburghians. And so I think that only works if you have the design thought out in advance and it's part of the program. There's an urban basic mobility element to it where there's an experiment where certain selected participants have their passes paid for, and Carnegie Mellon researchers are going to look at that at the end of the program and see, well, how was this used? How do we do this better next time? Where is service happening that we needed it to? Where is service not happening that we wanted it to? So I think that degree of deliberation and design is going to be kind of a game changer that's very different from previous programs.
And if I may ask real quick, so one of the things that we always had thinking in the past is that we need to distinguish between a private fleet of devices and a public. And I think what we're starting seeing right now, we have the technology, we have the tools, we have the means in which we can have one particular vehicle be serving both purposes. That can be perhaps you say a tech bro taking a bicycle, but after that is a dad basically doing groceries or something else, going to a job, right? Or the same thing that we have private mobility solutions out there. And when you guys go to the event later today in Brightland, there's a bus there, fully private. There's a train, fully private. Can we start leveraging all these private mobility solutions and identifying where we can come in and provide public service, right? And we start seeing that more and more and more. And that's why the partnerships we have with Lyft, with Uber during COVID, when we actually had to eliminate some bus route and we provided a voucher program. We were not basically providing a voucher program for every trip. We were doing it for the essential employees that needed to go to their work from midnight to 5 a.m., right? So there's an opportunity for us to introduce policies like that can help leverage all the devices, all the vehicles that are out there towards public good.
I'm curious too, in that like blended public-private and private-public, questions like liability and who pays and how is actually really an interesting question, and one that's we're still sort of exploring and figuring out. If only we had an expert in the room that could help us sort through some of those questions. So Ed, I'd love
as long as I don't put everyone to sleep, yeah.
I'd love to hear what your thoughts are and sort of what is the emerging trends or the industry sort of feedback that you're seeing, and how can we refine our understanding of some of those questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big thing to address here is to essentially give more of a benchmark of where the insurance community has come along with ride sharing, with scooter sharing, with micromobility. You know, back when Uber and Lyft first came into the market, the insurance market in and of itself was in an incredibly soft place. You could even argue it was about as cheap as you could find for insurance in the history of insurance. And now fast forward today, and this is completely separate from micromobility and sharing economy, we're actually in the most volatile insurance market that's ever existed. I have many of my mentors and people in the industry, many of my senior, are telling me, we've never seen anything like this. And really how this pans out to where we are now is, we had a lot of insurance carriers wanting to get involved in the space initially because it was a soft market. It was we want to provide limit. We'd love to get creative with Uber and Lyft. And what they found out very quickly was these are not typical business-owned vehicles being driven to and from work. The loss history, and Liberty Mutual might comment on this very heavily, but they were one of the first to get in the space. The loss history was very unexpected. And I bring up this entire context because what this did to the industry in of itself is very quickly categorized ride-sharing, micromobility, and the like as something that we do not have any understanding behind. And in order to write this, in order to keep insurance carriers involved, in order to protect your constituents in Miami and to protect the community riding these scooters, these bikes, and riding in these vehicles, we need to get a better understanding of these risks. And I mentioned earlier that investment on each and every one of these operators' behalves, many of them have really spent a lot of dollars into the safety, into the understanding and the codification of their new industry exposures, and been able to convey that. And thanks to a lot of partners like Hub International and the like, we've been able to communicate to carriers and the community really what the over-the-road exposure is. How risky is this new industry segment? How can we discuss this? And that open sharing of that information really is of use to municipalities, to individuals. I would say anyone here who rides a scooter to work, my hat's off to you for doing so, but a very commonly overlooked factor in that is your automobile liability or homeowner's policy will not cover if you get in an accident and you cause somebody else to get in a wreck. I would tell anybody here who uses a scooter more than once a week, go ahead and spend $500 with your insurance agent to get an umbrella policy. Make sure you are there and protected, because I can bet that most people in this room didn't know that that would be the case. So education of all of these new little pieces and economies we're building that we could still be building. Boat sharing is a new concept I've seen growing very heavily in the past couple of years. Our understanding of these risks is not just helpful from keeping insurance companies involved in protecting, but helping individuals like Carlos design policy that doesn't leave his constituents short-handed. And I think the whole guise of this conversation is around sharing information. All of these components are critically important to making sure this ecosystem moves forward successfully.
So one of the important pieces that you mentioned there was having the information about where near misses might happen or where hotspots might be. And I'm curious, from Palm Beach Regional Planning Agency perspective, how you're using that information to guide investments or to do that long-range planning that can really identify those trouble spots and then begin to address them using this new data or new information that you might be able to use.
Sure. So we have a Vision Zero policy, which is the vision and the goal of zero traffic-related fatalities and serious injuries. And we look at where all those crashes are happening on our system and focus on those key areas. We actually do a quarterly report and individually follow up on each location where the serious injury and a fatality happened with the roadway owner, with the local municipality, to find those solutions for the infrastructure to help implement countermeasures. But it really is, we mentioned some E's earlier, but also there's the 5 E's of engineering, education, evaluation, encouragement, and enforcement. All these things that are trying to educate, but also guide people in an engineering way to be able to to be able to move in a safe, efficient, and connected way. I think that if we're able to really make that safe, efficient, and connected system, at least at the ground level, the infrastructure level, then every trip begins and ends as a pedestrian, whether you're walking out your front door or even getting into your car. So if we make a safe system for all users of all ages and abilities, we can build off that with all these other options. And at the end of the day, people want an easy and simple and safe way and reliable way to get around. So, and they want options.
Carlos, I'm curious your thoughts from the Miami perspective. You've been a leader in bringing micromobility options and microtransit to the region. How are you using that data and that information to make those investments, or even tie them to some of those operating areas and the service characteristics?
So for the data you talk about, and the safety components in the data, right? So we need to start planning and putting our investment based on the outcomes we want to achieve, right? Typically, engineering approach and planning approach would be we want to reduce travel times, and we want to, we want to be safe. But it is a metric, but not necessarily an outcome or a goal for our community. So one of the things we're starting to do, and hopefully by next year we'll have it all in place. We are establishing, we're picking up on the delivery of the social benefit calculator that we deliver with Cityfied, and now we're going to build a strategic plan for Miami-Dade County. When we start looking at the outcomes, by making this bike lane, yes, we're going to be safe, and it's going to be protected bike lanes. It's going to be comfort. It's a level of transportation happiness. You remember that, right, from LADOT a few years ago. But can we measure how many jobs that person actually have access to? Can we measure the impacts to the economy? Can we measure all the other aspects, right? And I think by changing that narrative, we'll be able to start identifying what projects have a higher impact for our community and do those first. And I think that's where we start getting into devices and scooters on the sidewalk. It is a clutter, and it can actually be a liability issue for people tripping down. But to me, it's a clear indication that we don't have a space for them to park. So instead of basically fighting them, let's identify a place for park. So a scooter riding on the sidewalk, I think what you mentioned earlier is the fact that some people don't feel comfortable riding a bicycle or scooter on the travel lane or even on the bike lane. Guys, we have bike lanes adjacent to 35 miles an hour cars, like next to each other. Right, Mayor? That we have that, and to me is, will you feel comfortable with a car passing by merely 3 feet away, which is the law, at that speed? And probably the answer is no. So I'd rather sometimes go into the sidewalk. So that means that we don't have the right infrastructure. Miami-Dade County started building now separated and protected bike lanes and start making sure that we identify the right space and the right level of comfort. And what I'm starting to see and what I hope to see is that the utilization of those lanes increase, that the level of comfort increase, that people now feel more willing to leave their car behind and start getting into where they need to go and get a little active, right? There's all these benefits that we need to start measuring, and I'm really thrilled to start seeing how we bring safety, liability, and we talked a little bit about that. But it's not only how it saves us money, but by reducing and making sure that we right-size the liability component to it, I believe we can reduce the premium cost for the people asking for it. And ideally, the cost of operation goes down. So to me, the benefits of using all that goes across the board, and we just need to continue to get from data to insights to actions.
I love that frame, data insights to actions, and especially as we think about looking ahead from the full toolbox of what public agencies have in managing innovation. So using their streets and their infrastructure to guide innovation into certain areas through investments and other things, and even using the payment platforms that you mentioned to allow customers who might not have a digital way to pay a new access point for financial inclusion and digital payment tools. So Ashwini, I was curious from your perspective how the company, how Tira is thinking about the accounts that customers have to use in order to access the platform. On one hand, it ensures you can know who your customers are and do some training on safety and other measures, but it also could be a barrier to some folks having access to micromobility choices. So how are you seeing some of those innovations play out in Europe and here in the US?
Yeah, no, I mean, for us, it's somewhat baseline, needing to know who's taking that ride for liability purposes, for purposes of if something happens we bear some degree of responsibility. And so, starting from that as a starting point, how do you then overcome? Certain communities might have an aversion to signing up for services. A lot of communities may see this as not for them because historically, mobility innovation hasn't come to their community initially, and so it has been. I say tech bros as a catch-all, but a lot of the innovations in the mobility space that we're all very excited about, they only work for you if you can afford it. They only work for you if you are. If you're tech savvy, if you're enabled in a way already to take advantage of it, or if you're a tourist, a lot of the services are geared to the profile of trips you might want to take, and that's where I think private operators have a little catch up to do with the public sector, because the public sector is thinking about, well, how are you solving equity while you're providing this service? It's great that that this is a service that tourists like, that people want when they come to my city, but how are you serving all of Miami? How are you serving all of New York through this service? And so I think that comes back to that deliberate design. And so, in the integrations that we do across Europe, we do it through Google Maps, we do it through FreeNow, which is a rideshare platform, we do it through individual public transit agency platforms. We're fairly agnostic. We're kind of easy. We'll partner with anyone. But at the end of the day, you kind of need to know who's taking that ride. And through those integrations and through those partnerships, I think we have an opportunity to reach a broader segment of riders. And I think the thing that is the most remarkable to me about the transit integrations that are working the best are those are ones where we've got the deepest roots into communities that we might not otherwise serve. And you get those introductions. You have the benefit of working with a DOT, working with a transit agency to go into communities to say, you may not be familiar with scooters. You may think it's a tech bro thing. You may think it's a tourist thing. But actually, here's how it can unlock opportunity for you in your communities. And here's how you can use it if you don't have a means of payment. So what are the cashless options or the unbanked options that are available to you so that you can use it in your community? So I think once you sort of don that hat of we actually have this obligation, and I loved what Carlos said about, listen, if you're providing a service that serves a public service in addition to a private end, then maybe we shouldn't be levying fees on you for those trips. Maybe there should be a subsidy element. And so I think once you sort of get out of the rigid thinking of private operator, treat them in a private way, there's a fee associated with this service, to, well, what's the trip that you're providing, and for that trip, is there a fee associated with it, or is there a subsidy associated with it? Are we asking you to provide service in parts of the city you might not otherwise have been at times of day? Are you providing an accessible service? So not everyone can ride a bike or ride a scooter. If you're a wheelchair user, what's the service that I have as an option to be able to take advantage of, and how is the city partnering with me to sort of help reach those customers? So I think a lot more potential that we can unlock too.
I wanted to jump in. Those are great points, and just talking about the narrative, access to opportunity, access for all ages and abilities, all levels of income, access for everyone. I know that certain communities, I know that the city of West Palm Beach that we have here was looking into it, but probably Miami. But I remember being in LA, and LA Metro having the same pass that you use for your, and this was a few years ago, for your transit pass also works for your bike share, and also works for different modes of transportation, so that if you're a user, you can get across from point A to B, from door to door. And I think, and they also had programs for people that were students, that were lower income, having that discounted program so that it's accessible for everyone and really gets into all the different neighborhoods. And it's not just a service that's an attractor for tourists or people that it's a new fun thing to do on the weekend, but it's actually really serving as a mode of transportation and access to opportunity. And really, when you're talking about a multimodal city and talking about providing moving people in other more efficient and safe ways, it really relieves the burden on people, and you're able to not have to spend so much money on a car and be able to afford a better, affordable housing and other things that you're not making people have to have a car and have that burden.
So I wanted to jump in real quick. I think I like what you mentioned too, which is if it's the right mode for that person in that particular trip, there shouldn't be a reason why that person cannot afford it. And I think that's a better way to frame it, because if it's the right mode that is aligned with our goals, right, then it is our responsibility to help people move, right? I often mention that whether it's the first mile, the last mile, or the only mile, and an agency like Miami-Dade County Department of Transportation Public Works, a city, a transit agency, should be able to provide that for our users, right? So I think that's something that is critical to think about it in that way. And then at the same time, I'm glad you mentioned about equity. We think about equity in different ways, but one thing that we often forget when we talk about transit is the paratransit element of it, right? With people that are, and our residents, our neighbors, our friends that have limited ability to move around, they need the same level of service, not the same service, the same level of service. The expectation should be that they can move within our region at the same time, the same frequency, the same level of comfort, right? So ideally, I would love to start looking at how we can start modernizing that paratransit system with all the things that we're learning from the micromobility solutions, from the microtransit solutions. There's a lot of learnings that we'll be able to bring into and make sure that transit or mobility works for everyone.
One of the really interesting things that I've been working on lately is looking at the way that standards for data and information can be used to provide that modernized service, especially for things like paratransit, where knowing where your vehicle is and when it's going to arrive becomes a more essential component to a person's trip, and giving them the dignity of that travel the same way that other travelers in other modes have. So I'm just curious, as you think about that public and private collaboration and the use of standards for open data or for payments or for information, what is the role, or what is the, your perspective on where we're headed in terms of how cities and local governments and regions can make sure that all the mobility operators are conveying that information in a standardized way?
Yeah. Wow, that's good. Perfect. So I think it's critical. Definitely, we've done and we've proven that, as an industry, we're able to bring all transit information in a standard format, the GTFS format back in 2005, right? It took a little while, but we're able to do that. With micromobility, in terms of the front-facing component, GBFS is something that really became a standard, and you're sharing that for be able to be trip planning solutions. Now, the mobility data specification is another standard that's coming in that not only allow for over 120 cities already using that to make sure that they're getting the same type of data from all mobility providers are within the same ecosystem coming in. And at the same time, it's a benefit for you because now you don't have to integrate with 120 different standards or data in exchanges, but only once, right? Only one type. And at the same time, we talk about data as information that we're getting, but we need to talk about data as information that we're giving out, right? We are right now allowing technology solutions to be able to come into a public right away and basically interpret what we have for the rules of engagement. Right? For when you're driving your own car, you know there's a stop sign, you know there's a no parking zone, you know all these details. But we're just allowing for navigation applications or others. We have the opportunity to actually get and provide those policies, rules of engagement directly into our application, and that's what MDS does, right? Providing that policy in real time that you can use as levers to achieve better outcomes. Speed at 8 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour, we can do that. No riding zones, no parking zones, all those things we can do, right? So in making it standard, it makes it easy for us because once we get MDS in Miami-Dade County, Broward County and Palm Beach County can actually just take that. It's open source code and really help us move forward, and for the private sector, it's easy.
I'll just chime into that. I think you mentioned that we've come 10 years of learning, but now it's really everybody making their data public. We do that as a public agency. We have at our website, it's /data, all of our GIS, all of our information that we have is public, but also, like, for example, the GTSF feed, which is the real-time information, or the transit data, that's made, there's a one-stop shop for that for everybody who's involved, and then the private apps, and everybody can pull from that. But I think now we're entering this level of, like, how can we all work together and be aware of each other's data? What are those policies? What are those platforms that is the one-stop shop of, here's all the ped bike facility infrastructure, here's all of the crashes, here is all of the ridership, and we're trying to each do that, but I don't think that level of awareness or one-stop shop is really well known to everybody yet. But by doing that, working together, we can find those solutions and make it all work together.
Yeah, as an MPO, you're responsible for that regional coordination around the physical infrastructure. Do you think that there's a future for MPOs to manage regional digital infrastructure and the way that data is exchanged and made public to the proper operators?
We're definitely trying to aim at being that one-stop shop for that information, and we haven't gone into the real-time data, but we can incorporate all of that. We're trying to show all the different information across, even though we prioritize state and federal dollars and those transportation projects, but we're trying to get everybody else's projects, and we have an interactive map actually as well with various levels of everything that's going on, of everything that we're aware of. But we could be, as a regional entity, we have the Miami urbanized area, which is 3 counties, Palm Beach, Broward, and Miami. We have a regional transportation plan. We could be a one-stop shop for data. We definitely work together on getting data. So that could be an option in the future.
Yeah, super interesting.
No, and I was going to jump in. One of the things that we're trying to do here in Miami-Dade County, we're a county, and as a county, we're big in some states. We have 34 municipalities, and half our population is outside of that. So instead of actually coordinating with 35 different municipalities, we're bringing that as an original digital policies. We're bringing that into one feed, right? And I think that is of value because, as you might know, the mobility doesn't respect jurisdiction and boundaries, right? In some other places, like you're from the Bay Area, right? To go to San Francisco to Oakland, you need to cross a bridge. Here, from Coral Gables to Miami, cross a street, right? So it is so close and so easy to do that, and we need to make sure that it's seamless for a region, and ideally later we will go into the full region of the Miami Great Area.
We have just a couple of minutes left, so I want to make sure to open it up for Q&A and questions from the audience. So feel free to grab a space at either of the 2 microphones. And while you're getting your questions in your brain, I'll just end by asking the panel, if you're thinking about the innovation and what's next in this next phase of public-private collaboration, what's the one piece that you'd want the audience to take away from when you think about the next year or the next 2 years of public-private opportunities together?
I can take a stab at that. I think what I hope to see and what I'm starting to see is an embrace of new mobility modes by transit operators, by transit agencies, and transportation regulators. And so what was new and kind of different over the last 5 years or so, scooters have become much more mainstream. They've become more like how cities approach bike share. And I think that transition will continue to where I think these services will be embraced much in the way that I hinted at earlier, much as the way the city bus is considered to be, as American as, the library and the post office. You're going to have these other modes as embraced by cities as it may have started out as a private service, but it provides a public service for a lot of our riders, and it's something that it's another tool in the toolbox.
Great. Ed?
Yeah, like I alluded to earlier, it's been almost cool to see a competitive environment around safety, and that also has the unfortunate outcome of it being very proprietary. And I guess I would be hopeful to see in all of these different forms of ride sharing and shared mobility that a bit of standards begin to be acknowledged as to what really compromises a safe program. What should the goals year over year be based on geography? How can we really be open about that as to achieve certain metrics and maybe even provide a tiered program for permits and regulation to reward these operators for this well-disciplined behavior? I guess that would be ideally what I would see.
Amazing.
I would just say more collaboration and communication between the public and private sectors to find solutions, and potentially from the federal government level, looking at what are the national, international best practices on this, and helping to from the macro to the micro scale, push that out.
So I'm going to seal here. I'm going to do two, right? So we play two roles, right? We are mobility providers and we are regulators. So starting with regulator first, what I'd love to see is for us to continue to work together to enable digital policies that we can actually deliver messages a lot quicker. We can actually react, measure, and react again, right? That's the first thing. And the second thing is we, as a public transportation provider, we are limited in our resources. And now more than ever, you heard yesterday from our mayor, it's very hard for us to basically hire bus operators. So what I would love to see is for us to continue to identify mobility solutions that can come in private, but we can tap into for public service. Right, and there's a lot of potential partners that we'll be able to do. I'm looking forward to our partners at Brightline. I'm looking forward to all the other mobility solutions out there because I see that there's a potential for that to work.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you, panelists, for this amazing conversation. And key takeaway from all of us, I think, up here is that we're all optimistic and have a lot of enthusiasm for the future of public-private collaboration in order to achieve our city's community goals. So appreciate you all in the audience today. If you give a round of applause for our panel.